are you doing, sir?
I'm hanging in there. I was just telling you in our little pre huddle that we're going through some sleep training issues with my young son, and that's causing some stress and sleep deprivation, and we're trying to intervene there, but it's tricky. So yeah, we're working through that.
Yeah, yeah. Good luck with that.
Thank you. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
I did want to mention, I was just listening to some of the shorts that came out of the episode we recently released. The Self is a Fortune Cookie. And I really like that episode. And I really like that metaphor. So, yeah, a
Yep.
quick
I
plug that,
I got a comment on that also.
yeah,
A straight message, personal message to me about someone liking it.
yeah, yeah, I really like that episode in particular. And this is sort of related. It's more of an internal topic,
Uh-huh.
but I thought I would toss it at you. And in some of the coaching work that I've been doing lately, this has come up, and it's just kind of a topic I've been curious about for a long time, and that's anger. I
Mhm.
don't think we've done an episode about anger, and I'm curious to kind of there are some obvious like psychological frameworks through which to look at it. And I wonder also if it plays a role in the bigger picture kind of philosophy, metaphysics, how we've been talking about ethics. And so for example, some psychology models think of anger as a layer emotion, right? That it's that when we experience anger, it's a clue that something else is going on, such as fear, right? And it's a way that we have like an internal defense mechanism
Sure.
against experiencing that fear or owning that fear, or whatever you want to call it. Another one is a signal that we have violated our own boundary or allowed a boundary to be violated or experienced the violation of a boundary. And I think those two models juxtaposed yield some interesting fruit because they might both be true in different ways. Where
Sure.
in that model, you think of anger as more of a root emotion, right? Yeah, there might be fear or shame or something experienced when we have a boundary violated, but we're also getting this direct feedback loop about our needs that we can act on without potentially doing more exploration. So, yeah, curious to kind of kick that around a little
Yeah.
bit, see what your model of anger looks like, and then maybe we can connect in some philosophy too.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Um, I guess the foundation of that conversation, I mean, probably lays around this idea that anger is an energetic condition. And so that means it exists in this curious in a human, which is this curious mix of matter and mind. And energetic conditions sort of represent the fact that there's communication across that mysterious gap, because in some cases anger, that which is to say that the body pushes on the mind and the mind pushes on the body, and vice versa, they pull and push on each other. So what I mean to say by that is that you can be in a condition, a physical condition that Chinese medicine would associate with the liver, that will tend to make anger arise out of balance against the background, as something that starts to show up, because anger is a natural part of our response to our environment. Okay, so at the same time, I suppose psychologically you could get yourself wound up into a place where anger was your go-to response, and that might lend a negative influence on the liver. Although I suspect that it tends to run the other way because of the way that consciousness rides on the organ systems. But so that's one sense, and that might be maybe a more applicable to a more momentary kind of situation. When things get chronic, um, it could be chronic in a physical sense because one has a lot of bad habits, it's not, everybody knows the I hate you drunks, right? Well, we know alcohol affects the liver. And so some people tend to get angry and violent when they're drunk because there's a lot of pressures put on the liver function. And we can think of the liver as associated with the smooth movement of things and of energy, associated with wood, right? Um, but if we look at it from a Freudian standpoint, I think it's loosely Freudian. There's this idea that we have primary drives, secondary drives, and tertiary drives, and that the primary drives are always natural. They come from just, the necessity of being a human.
And by natural, maybe you're saying from the matter side of the mind matter.
And I think some of this from the psychological also, the need for nurturing as a child, the need for interaction, um, the need for security, the need, things that are drives that humans naturally, get out of the rain and then these secondary drives are considered reactionary formations that come from the frustration of those primary drives. And I think in that model, these secondary drives are always destructive, they're always negative. And then there's this idea that there's no sustainability in acting out of these secondary drives. So we have these tertiary drives which are sort of forced on us by the demands of society and interaction to force us to be polite, to force us to smooth things in our relationships. Like the famous joke where the two women meet each other after years and years and they went to school together. And the one woman starts off just, this like naturally the story is, well, what's happened to you since school? And so the one woman starts, well, I married this super rich guy. And the other lady says, oh, how wonderful. He says, and we tour the globe. And the other lady says, oh, how wonderful. And we, are welcomed into the highest circles. And oh, how wonderful. And it goes on like that, right? With a list of and it's always how wonderful, right? And then finally the lady says, well, what about you? What did you do after school? And she says, well, after I went to school, I went to finishing school. Which was a thing, right? A very New Englandy kind of thing, finishing school. He said, "Oh, I after I got married, I never went to finishing school or anything like that. What do they teach you in finishing school?" And she says, "Oh, basically, to say how wonderful instead of what a load of crap." Right? So so I like that story because it's an illustration of how the tertiary drive, the things that she learned to be in polite and couth society were to override her deeper and more knee-jerk reactions to, the environment. And so anger can sit in that same place. Right? It's gonna be anger that's gonna wanna say, "Oh, what a load of," it's fucking and, luckily not a lot of people have to drive with me, but, and I call it recreational anger because there is a point where anger does serve a purpose, right? It is, in some sense, a recreation, or a rebalancing of a certain energy, right? The expression of a certain energy that's can be a self-righting boat mechanism. And it reminds me also of a time when I was in college. And when I was in college back east, the dormitory was a really tall, like three-story building, but it had this like short portico with a metal cladding of some kind right in front of a window. and some kids had climbed out onto this thing, and it was like, this was a serious fall if you fall off of this. And there was this guy that I knew, very curious character from the Eastern Campus of St. John's, and he was a member, or maybe the founding member and mainstay of the gardening club. And what he was doing at the time was, at the campus there, they have a thing called the Liberty Tree, which was a tulip tree that was planted in the year of 1776, the year of the signing of everything. So they call it the Liberty Tree, and they would take scions off of that, which is to say they would take a snipping of it and they would graft it onto another tulip tree that had been started at the Maryland State Forestry Farm or something like that. And then they would give those to different dignitaries from visiting democracies. Here's your, clone of the Liberty Tree, right? So they had this, and this was one of his projects. So a
Very
couple
cool.
times, yeah, it's kind of a fun idea. And what he would do is he would travel around the East and go to all of these champion tulip trees, which it turns out is a thing. Who knew? Botanists are an interesting crew. And but so his theory was, for some reason, these trees that were champion trees, they were the oldest, the biggest, the straightest, the whatever the criterion is for a champion tree. Usually it's age. But his idea was, for some reason, something about these trees, they didn't get hit by lightning. They didn't get, and they've managed to last these hundreds of years because these were enormous trees. Like, some of these, we're trying to get a branch so that we could take cuttings so that we could clone those onto these rootstock, which is how they do a lot of trees. Um, and sometimes the first branches of these trees, we'd need a really long pole to try to get up there to try to saw off a branch that we could take a few starts off of, basically. And but so the point is, I spent a bunch of time with this guy traveling from here to there, and so I kind of had a feel for what his pulse was. And he's there with me at this I don't know, it was kind of like a field day or something at the campus, so nobody was in class, and these kids had crawled out onto this roof, and this guy just goes off like, "Whoa, Nelly," like, just freaks out on them, and it was like, and they just immediately turned around and climb back in the window, and and then he looks to me, perfectly calm, perfectly collected, and he says, "If I don't do that, they won't listen to me." And I thought, whoa, it's like having a bomb go off next to you. And then it turns out, that, well, this was, I don't know that it was theater, because I don't know that you could act that really. But it clearly, he had a valve and he could let it out or shut it off as necessary, so
As you said, botanists are interesting people.
it was an energetic communication, but it didn't own him somehow, and it was interesting to show that, because we think of people use as anger is out of control.
Yeah.
Well, that's not always necessarily the case, and we do have this concept of righteous anger, you know? And sometimes righteous anger does have this action at a distance, you know? Uh, I remember when I think I might have mentioned another episode where somebody was trying to shoot somebody else up with heroin, and in order to take advantage of them, and I had let it be known that this was unacceptable by my standards of behavior, and I was going to reach out and touch someone if I thought that was necessary. And and then it came back to me that he had tried and wasn't successful. And there were a few people with me, and I was like, "He what?" And I smacked something, which is very unusual for me. I'm usually very precise about my smackings. But it was like, "What?" And the word from the few people that were in the office at the time went out, and the guy carried a gun for about a week and then moved to Florida. We never had words, and I mean, maybe his other life events, but it did come back to me that he had heard that I was really pissed. And he knew that, we were going to have an unpleasant encounter. So sometimes anger does serve a purpose, and sometimes you have to push. But if it owns us, then it's all gone. And that's like almost I would class that as an almost entirely different phenomenon. When
Yeah.
it
So
owns us as opposed to when we're using it maybe in its correct and appropriate place. And this is something that I need to footnote, and that is when you're capable of violence, you are in a very dicey position, and you have to realize the complications of that, because even if you don't use that violence on people, they will always know psychologically that that possibility exists. And the way my teachers put it is they said you have to make a beautiful personality, a beautiful personality. So people know that you will never be the victim of your own anger, though the possibility exists that other people may be the victim of it. They need to know that you will never be unjust in the application of that anger. They need to know that that anger, should it ever possibly show up, will only ever be on the side of what is correct and what is just and what opposes, suffering, and that it would never be used injudiciously. And they have to feel that in their belly, not just think it intellectually. Only then are you safe walking around with that kind of power. Right. So so that's sort of we hope that people that are professionals in our society that wield that kind of power hold that type of responsibility in their heads, because we see that if they don't, the ramifications are, oh my God, we've created a monster. Right. And this is like the Buddhists. We have this thing that I think I might have mentioned before of the three vases, that the students are like three different types of vases. The bad students are. I mean, all students are kinds of vases, but the three to look out for: the one that's upside down, nothing goes in; the one that's cracked, whatever goes in eventually is gone. But the worst kind is the one that already has poison in it. So whatever pours in gets mixed with poison. Only poison comes out, right? So, so, um, so this is kind of a variation of that, and this is the teachers telling you, don't be that vase with poison. And you have to realize that poison is something that maybe, given circumstances, can naturally accumulate within a person, and so you have a responsibility now to never let that poison accumulate. It's a heavy trip, really.
it is, and it in in conjunction with kind of like formalizing the responsibility to not be the victim of your own anger. I really like that phrase. I wonder how much of a how there was packaged with that, because that's not an easy feat. And um, uh, the more practice of violence one undertakes, and the more power one can manifest,
Yeah,
the greater the risk.
right,
Um,
absolutely.
so
Well,
so I
here's one of the
imagine.
there's a practical aspect to it, and that is that if you're fighting with a well-trained opponent, which typically is a training partner, they know, and or will learn shortly, that if they can piss you off, they will play you like a piano, because the body, when it's being controlled by anger, makes all sorts of just biological mistakes that a well-trained fighter is, because you're gonna telegraph more. You're gonna take stupid bait that you shouldn't take. You're gonna push things beyond what like, you're just gonna get
Not
really
just
s
in writing, I mean,
it's
in general,
it's it's
those
software.
dynamics. Yeah.
It's a software glitch that happens when you do that, and so one of the easiest ways to dominate somebody is to piss them off.
So I'm
That's
thinking
why you
about
need to become immune to that, because it's one of the easiest ways you can be manipulated. So you don't think, I never think about it, it's like my friend was a biker, and he told me about defensive driving, right? And there's a parallel here. The average person thinks about defensive driving is kind of like, let's allow the other person to make a mistake and make margin for that. And it sounds very domesticated, right? And it's like, we're just making it all work for the good of everybody, right? And it's like, well, that's the same people have about anger. It's like, well, anger is probably not good. And we don't want to hurt other people, so we probably shouldn't be anger. But the way the Hell's Angel guy taught me, he said, you need to drive. Defensive driving is thinking someone out there is going to go, hey, there's Brian, let's kill him. And so I'm not thinking about anger like, oh, I shouldn't be angry because I'll, make people unhappy. No, anger is a huge weakness. If I can be made angry, then my opponents, my enemies will capture me. My opponents will destroy me in battle. Like this is like a huge. It's like missing a tire on your car. You're not going to win any races. You're not even going to make it to the 7-Eleven. It's not for other people and the damage you might do that you don't have anger. I mean, that's all true, but to have anger is this poison that will totally lay you out. You
so let's
can't
talk
afford that weakness as a warrior. You can't afford that. So you just have to see it as a weakness. You have to see it as your childhood, not letting go of it's just a tantrum, right? Like you have to outgrow that shit. You're going to be an adult. You have to outgrow that. You don't have the luxury of a tantrum for fuck's sake. Jesus. I mean, come on.
so we have to slow that part down because because I mean, if you can intervene internally and tell yourself that at the right time, then you might head anger off and prevent it from running the show, or prevent yourself from being its victim. But there's a technology to that, and there's push-ups to that. Actually, a variety of technologies. So for example, one technique that I have found useful, not just for anger, but for emotions in general, is when they come up, accepting them, because being in resistance to an emotion that's arising will usually amplify it and make it come out sideways in some way.
Yeah,
So
good point.
so acceptance is like a continual loop that one can run to, and that requires awareness, right? So the awareness, acceptance, and then you have more choice. If you can say,
Mhm.
oh, I'm feeling angry, then you have more choice about whether you're going to act it out. um,
Sure.
Thich Nhat Hanh's book on I think it's called Cooling Anger, or maybe it's just called On Anger, but it's all about what he calls cooling anger, is one long mindfulness exercise. There's various walking mindfulness and just mindfulness throughout the day, but it's all about noticing and marking what's happening in
Mhm.
order to be present and have more choice. When you think about, we're adults, we need to manage this shit. What kinds of techniques help somebody through adolescence and into that state?
Mm. Well, it might be I know it's kind of unhip to talk about role models, but it might be that you learn patterns from people that sort of have the solution of how you get out of that position energetically. Uh, I think that maybe there's an in between stage between everything's fine and anger that's you're wrestling with that I might call it being rankled. you know I don't feel like I am ever out of under the control of my anger, uh though it is very, very rare that I let it out of the box. That doesn't mean that I'm not rankled at times, right? And
No.
that's why I say if someone's riding along with me in the car, they might think from what I say that would had I an encounter with another driver, I might just be bashing their head on the hood or something. And the odds are uh, that were I to have a real encounter, the odds are I would be patient and polite. Doesn't mean that internally I wouldn't be going like that to their head on the hood, but uh, so in life one must suffer fools, uh, and that isn't always easy. But I think that sometimes you just you have to have that standpoint that of controlled folly, that everything you're doing, this whole thing is basically folly. And so if that helps you step back from the anger, I suppose there's different kinds of anger. There's anger because, I'm trying to pull out of the parking space at Walmart and there's somebody, who's challenged in the 3D world trying to move an oversized vehicle that they probably shouldn't have anything to do with, and maybe I have something to do, and there's that kind of anger. And there's the anger of someone, for example, who's robbing the resources for orphan children who are in want of food and medicine. The one in the parking lot is more likely to be a hot type of anger. "Ah!" The second one is gonna be a cold type of anger, and that's way scarier because that means that it's like, "Okay, this is unambiguous according to my compass." That means that, you know, I gotta do what I gotta do. Whereas in the hot anger, I'm going, "Okay, you idiot," you know? But I know this has gotta just be let go, just blow it off, just like the pressure valve, right? You just have to have that circuit. You just have to. And, maybe part of that is just having a pattern. My teachers were always just like, "Yeah, well, you just have to have that circuit," and you just do. That's all. It's not it's just the way the world is, and that's the way you're gonna be in the world. That's
I'm
part of the
wondering
deal.
if you develop that circuit fighting by
Yeah,
learning
yeah,
that every
probably.
time you got angry, it backfired, right?
It goes straight to your reptile brain. You'd be
Yeah,
surprised what a beating can can teach you.
right. Yeah, but I think a lot of people struggle with um, developing that circuit. It's not that they don't want to. I think, and
Yep,
you said
yep.
something a few minutes ago that that's your childhood, and we're adults, and so there's like in Ken Wilber language, right? There's a cleaning up and or
Yeah.
waking up
Mhm.
that's a process that one needs to go through,
Right.
and so maybe say more about that's your childhood, and anger has a legitimate role in the
Yeah,
adult
yeah.
emotional lexicon.
Well, I only wanna use anger when it achieves something, when it works. If it's not gonna work, then the odds are I'm in some movie playing out something from the past, you know? Why would I think it would work? Because a lot of times just being angry really doesn't work. Only in certain situations with certain inflections and certain setups will anger really work, you know? And for me, the idea of using physical force under the influence of anger is almost a never. Like, it's very hard for me to consider a situation like that. Now, maybe maybe by round 2 of a conflict in the street, maybe by then I'll be running on anger, I don't know. But it's certainly not gonna contribute to the conflict occurring. It may end up contributing to the conflict ending somehow, but, that absolutely can't have control of the bridge. Let's put it that way. Um, and that's just a learned thing, and maybe it is because the few times it happened, you get negatively reinforced. On the other hand, that's typically the problem of a hard student, and I was a soft student. So for me, a bigger challenge than controlling my anger was not ending up in the corner with my head tucked under, pulled into my shell and getting beaten about the head and shoulders. That was more of a problem. I had to actually learn how to turn into that and fire my motor. And, but I'm not even sure that that was anger that was motivating that. It was more like just pure survival, you know. In other words, certain types of emotions are just indulgences you can't afford. And I say indulgence in the way that we indulge children. But I was never one to indulge tantrums, uh, personally. Um, so,
You
you
mean
know,
your own or your children's or
my
both?
children's or my
Yeah,
own.
yeah.
Yeah.
So so
See, I guess I've also had people try to provoke me to lay a hand on them by making me angry, knowing that they wanted to be able to go say, "Oh, you to me," right? And I was like, "No, I don't take that bait." And that's why it's important, because you don't wanna be baited by being angry, you know?
so let's talk a little bit about what happens in the collective internal and external quadrants with anger. Um, right now, we've got these riots going on in LA, and ICE is rounding up, I assume, illegal immigrants. I'm not sure. And the National Guard, I think, is called in, or the military is called in to deal with the situation. And that seems to me like a manifestation of collective anger, maybe in a couple of different ways.
Mm.
Um, and I guess what my experience of collective anger is, there's like an inhumanness that can that can arise. So like, when I think about, for example, terrorism being in part the outcome of collective anger. Some individual anger too that contributes to
Yeah,
that, but
I wonder.
say
I
more.
honestly wonder. What I see going on in California now looks an awful lot like the lumpian proletariat. Uh, are you familiar with that idea? It's a Marxist idea. Uh, and the lumpian proletariat are lumpian means bum in German, right? So the lumpian proletariat are always the violent rabble that can be easily bought off by the elites. And typically, what they do is those are the ones that make their whole side look bad intentionally. So imagine if they were making if they were, and this is something I saw some just briefly. I didn't read it all, but some from Peter Coyote, who I guess has become a Zen master now. And he was saying, you shouldn't dress in masks and dress all in black. You should dress like you're going to church, and you should police yourself. So as soon as one person gets violent, you all just sit down and let the police take out the agents provocateur, because the lumpian proletariat are paid typically. And yes, there is some natural emotion there, but if you look at who they usually get a very particular psychological profile. And if you explore it, they are often compensated somehow. Now, this is I'm talking about historically, and that's kind of the role of the lumpen proletariat. That's why you always can get them for the right amount of cash, right? And but they're different. Like where was the righteous anger of the masses was the people maybe that wanted to support Luigi because they saw him as taking out somebody who was causing suffering. But I'm not sure that those are the same people that smash windows in mom and pop stores that are, not the they're not the enemy, right? The people that you're blocking in the highway, those people aren't the enemy. Those are supposed to be the people you're supposed to be representing. So and I had mentioned this before that you can be a great champion on your side, or you can be a sucky champion and go join the other side. And that way you achieve the same ends, right? You can make your side look good, or you can make the other side look bad. It's the same effect, right? So, or it's like this idea that the army doesn't want people under a certain IQ. Well, if they could, they would take those people, they would send them to the other side, right? Because they've done the cost benefit analysis, right? So that's typically the role of agents provocateur. And I have to say that I don't know, but the way that I look at the way things are coordinated and the fact that some money seems to be involved, that makes me think that there's the engineering of a public response.
So that might be interesting, and I could see how that could be the case. So let's take it back to how does collective anger show up, and
Well, you
um,
could see how that agents provocateur, they can't provoke just Joe Average. There is a certain person that is most vulnerable to those provocations. And as a category, they will tend to be people who are not in great control of their emotions because they're playable by their emotions. Anger is one of them. Indignation is another one of them. Victimhood is another one. Like there are certain things that if you're not standing solidly on both feet, you're going to be very swayable in a certain direction. And so, just like authoritarian personalities, there are people that if the police state says something, they just can't help but get in line and salute, right? So, I think these influences are always looking for the place where they can take hold. And there's probably a skill, a science, an art to working into those situations. And it can be for good or ill, I suppose, theoretically. Uh, there's the idea if you're the French resistance and you're fighting the Nazis, I suppose that's one thing. But then because here you were in your happy little life, and these people came in uniforms and tanks and literally took it away from you. So it's pretty clear who the enemy is. And then you could say, well, this seems like a righteous battle. On the other hand, uh, you could tell yourself that story because now we know that anybody can be called a Nazi, and then all of a sudden you might not explore the implications. Say, well, let's look at who's actually punishing innocent people, and you might find that there's a complicated mixture of what's going on here. That's my suspicion is that there's because remember it's easiest to rob a house when it's on fire, right? And it's easiest to kill with another's hand. Um, So I mean, it's maybe this is just because of my exposure, but whenever I see things, I'm always looking for strategies underneath them that they are the tells. I'm looking for the tells.
sure.
And I think that when you start moving on mass scales, it's very hard to cover the tells.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of the protests that we've seen over the last number of years, you could see protesters being bussed in, and
Right.
um,
It's a great
there's all
example.
kinds of questions there. But that's I mean, that's an interesting rabbit hole. But I want to bring it back to anger. I don't know if there's more to be said about collective anger, other than people can be played.
Mhm.
And then the other theme that I wanted to come back to was one you started with. It was kind of like bioenergetic. What are emotions? Um, and what models do you find useful for kind of working with that? Like,
Right.
people, not only are people vulnerable to getting their emotions played on, but emotions also give us really valuable information. And how do we recognize and use that? And and are-
Integrate it. Yeah.
and do you experience emotions primarily as physical things or mental things? And what are the norms around that? Like all that kind of
Right.
the mind matter connection that you started with.
Yeah. I think that the model that I typically go to is the 5 element from Chinese medicine, because that's where there tends to be this idea in the West that our emotions bear some, like, there's some invisible barrier between them and the functioning of our organs. And, with the nervous system sitting in some kind of an in-between zone, and
I think I'm assuming that the standard construct in the West for emotions is that they're mental, and people have to learn to recognize that they're also physical.
well, the psychopharmacologists have made quite an industry for themselves. Whether they're, uh, there is this go-to idea that I think comes from the reductionist materialist worldview, and I'm trying to think of whether it was for depression but I remember being told that the math seemed to indicate that between psychopharmaceutical intervention and talk therapies, which we could presume is saying one is coming in through the mind and the other's coming in through the body, that the best numbers come from a mixture of both. But I don't know who paid for that study. Um, but I do know that there are times that when people are in extreme situations where pharmaceutical interventions seem to make sense to move them a little farther from the cliff. Uh, but then typically more deeper understanding has to be brought in to change the whole configuration of the situation.
Yeah, my issue with the psychopharmacological approach to dealing with difficult psychology is that it just has the tendency, but almost by definition, I think, to isolate, and to say this chemical is causing this, and when you're angry, you're producing more of that, so we'll suppress it, and kind of working with the endocrine system, and system is the key word, right? So you start
Mhm.
isolating variables like that and
Yeah.
pretending
They've
you're not
mistaken.
working in a living system. You have all kinds of unforeseen consequences, and
Yep.
those can show up much later. They could be subtle, for a while. They could
Mhm.
be sudden, and like there's a huge correlation apparently between SSRIs and mass shooters.
Yeah, and SSRIs are one of these things that we don't really know all the long-term
Yeah.
implications of them, but we do know that serotonin, which is, an SSRI is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and so it's affecting that balance of serotonin, which we know has a lot of psychological implications and impacts, and but I think that we've got a classic case of mistaking a complex system for a complicated one.
Right. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so My feeling is that the way we go about dealing with complex systems is, as I've sort of mentioned before, it's a lot more like snake charming. It's understanding that this thing has a nature to it, and that it, that nature carries with it a logic of its own, and that we won't get long term or sustainable or results without unforeseen consequences by working against that logic or by ignoring it, and which is sort of the hyper mechanistic model tends to be. And and I've thought before, this is one of the things that I liked about ceremonies, and that approach is that it has a sort of a holism implicated, and that I often would see the psychopharmacological model as the kind of standing on the shore, standing on the beach, and lobbing these things out into the depths of the ocean, kind of not really seeing what's in there, or just kind of, well, we know that this, and lob it in there. And then the shaman is more like the little guy who walks up with fins and a spear gun, and he's like, "We're going in there, right? We're gonna actually gonna." Oh, but to do that, he's got to know that's a one of those, and here's a one of these, and this is what you do, and don't touch the end of that thing, and all of those sorts of things, and different skill set. Uh, but the difference is that one has a kind of like a fundamentally inanimate picture, and the other has a sort of a respect for the animate web that everything is a part of, and so that every kind of issue happens within a constellation of elements that are outside of itself. Um, and here we are as humans within that web, exerting our will here and there, to the best we can. But and this is where emotions become another thing to navigate in a way. There's a famous story about anger where someone goes to the Zen master, and he says, I have this problem with anger. What should I do? And the Zen master says, "What is this anger? Show it to me." And the guy's like, "Well, I can't I can't just show it to you. It's like this thing that happens, and he sort of uses that as so I guess it's not you then, right? Because you're here, but it's not here. So what is this thing? And uh but anyway, I guess the point is that the observer is different, that emotion happens on a shell that's outside of that observing self. And so part of all mindfulness does is move you back to that observing self, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's what the Marshall setup is. Also, it's a form of mindfulness, except it's like every time you lose mindfulness,
You
your
get smacked.
reptile brain gets zapped, and oh yeah, that's right, and so it's a little different than quietist practices.
I
Um,
imagine frequently, even if you maintain mindfulness, you're getting zapped.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, because there's a lot of different levels, it becomes 3D chess. And so you stop making stupid mistakes and you start making the just slightly less stupid mistakes. And then you work your way up there to where you're at. It's actually chess problems, and that's why, I had videos way back in the day of VHS. They were these cassette things, and we would put them in these machines for you kids out there, and it was a tape, and the tape would go around, but anyway, we had some of these where I was fighting with down in Florida with one of my little brothers, and he was we fought each other all the time, and everybody knew every card in each other's deck, and So it got to, he's maybe a little faster than me, but I'm actually have a longer reach than him. So there's some compensation and I know what he likes and he knows what I like, and so there would be these times when we're just standing there and very small things are happening, maybe for one of us to try to sneakily get a little bit of enough of an advantage that we could pull something off. But it was because we knew each other's game at such a level that it was very hard to know what was going on from the outside, like that. But I think that that's sort of the game that we play with reality, right? Is that we start out, we make really silly mistakes. And then it isn't that we stop making mistakes, it's that we start making better and better mistakes that that are mistakes that learn us more stuff.
Mm,
Put it that way. And particularly say that in a passive way because
yeah,
it a lot of it happens to us,
yeah,
and you're like, "Whoa," it's gonna keep hitting you in the head until you get it, and literally in some cases,
literally, right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, and there was uh I remember this is a fun story. There was, I think I mentioned before, I was second ranked in my teacher's school when he showed up in our town. I was the seventh student in that school. But the guys that were students ranked three, four, five, six, seven on down were buddies with the guy who was the first ranked. And they were all older than me. I was like 14 or 15, something like that. And they had been in the military and, but they were probably mid 20s types and so there was one guy who was third ranked right below me, and this guy just had my number. And I would always end up, he'd get my front hand pushed across, and I'd always end up, you know, basically being beaten about the head and shoulders. And then Cho came, Peter's teacher, Grandmaster Cho. And he watched me fight, and he came over and he grabbed the cuff of my front leg and he pulled it over, I don't know, 6 inches, 7 inches, something like that. And he said, "Fight like that," and changed everything. Right, changed everything. But it also it meant that I had to face things in a different way. Let's put it that way, literally in this case. And it turned out that when I faced things in that different way, I had these other resources that filled in the gaps that was where he kept rushing in. And that was it. But it was this also shows you how a real master can see right in and decode right away and then make one little it's like that story knowing where to hit with the hammer, right?
Yeah. We didn't talk about Cho when we talked about teachers. You mentioned him, but we didn't really get into it.
Mhm. Yeah, Cho was a phenom. He was a Korean national champ, dominated for 9 years, 250 bouts undefeated, retired undefeated, and, I think he was the Korean national champ in either 1963 or '64, middle heavyweight, and beat the Japanese national champion right around that time, and the Japanese newspapers called him the stepping king because of the way he controlled stepping. And but Cho was another level. Cho's the kind of person doesn't come along all the time. And because he just had this naturalness with both the it's not, we say taekwondo and everybody goes, "Oh, I know what taekwondo is," because you look and you see and there's a very and there certain kind of uniform. But taekwondo is made up of 9 different kwans. And each kwan had a different master that was the head of that kwan, and some disappeared in the war, and so they have a very different, unique lineages within those kwans. So my first school was in Cheongdo Kwan, and then I moved from Cheongdo Kwan to Jido Kwan. And while they're all a Korean system, the way they went about things was very different. So Master Cho called his style country style, and the other styles were like military style or city style. And so Cho's style was really like it wasn't robotic like the military style. It wasn't real tight like the city or styles. It was much longer and it he was called the stepping king because he could cover distance so smoothly and also because the stepping was contributing a lot to the power of his hits. So it's like getting a big running start before you bang your head into something, rather than just banging your head. Or though he would say it's the difference between I punch you with my arm or I ride by on a bicycle and I punch you with this arm. Same punch, but the one on the bicycle is going to have a lot more oomph behind it. And so controlling stepping becomes the whole dance. And so my what I'm used to is I'm already tracking and doing stuff when the average karate person hasn't yet pulled up into range. They don't think anything's going on yet. In that
Mm.
distance, we usually is when you're close enough that you can hit somebody with your back leg, which is usually your longest action without a step. So I want to start everything from way before that. I'm only going to want to get close when I've already manipulated the situation through manipulating your expectation of what's going to happen and then tracking what you do about it, all from outside where I'm safe as much as possible. Not everybody gives you that opportunity. So you have to have ways to solve that problem. But as soon as you do solve the problem now, the way to think about it is I've got a longer action. And when they come across that line, I make them pay a toll. And then I give them a little territory and I set the toll booth up a little bit. You're right. And every time they try to come to me, I move away what they're coming for and I make them pay another toll. And I want to keep making them pay a toll until they're out of money or they've shown me so much I can just come in and just take them out. And and that's the safest way to do things. The way they Cho would describe it is like a dog fights a bear. Dog knows bear get him once, it's over. He also knows he's gonna have to bite that bear 100 times before that bear even slows down, and he's not gonna go in toe to toe with that bear until he's already worn that bear down significantly, and so that's kind of our model is we wanna control distance and only cross arms when we have the advantage, and, but that's also a lot about mobility, so one of the things that, there's 2 things you need. You need endurance. Your dog's gotta be able to run away a long time. The other thing you need is you need real spring power, which is like a tendon power. So if you wanna develop that, go run barefoot on the beach with a soccer ball. And so now and then just do it for miles. And, you do it with a friend or, a couple friends or whatever, but the point is you're not jogging. You're speeding up, you're slowing down, you gotta move to the left, you gotta move to the right, and you're doing it in sand. So it's all working your ankles and your calves, which gives you when you're on solid ground, it gives you the spring kind of movement. And you wanna be able to do that leprechaun style, you know, for a long time, you know? And, but anyway, that's sort of where Cho's style is, although Cho also very good judo.
Hmm.
So that's another thing is maybe you whoosh in there and you do a takedown actions, hit the person with the planet. And, with a really big person, takedowns are can be a significant, slowdown for them.
Sure.
you know you know?
Cool. Well, I'm glad we worked Cho in there a little bit too.
Yeah, Cho is a very interesting character, he was a police detective and part of the Korean, like CIA kind of secret thing, and,
Huh.
he did end up ultimately leaving Korea, and he teaches in Milwaukee. or he has schools in Milwaukee. I don't know that he teaches much, but he has black belt students, and he's probably got black belt students now all over,
Mhm.
you know. Um, and but
I wonder if any are in the UFC.
I wonder. I know that unfortunately, when babysitting schools became popular, I believe, I don't know that it's still the case, but at least it was. I was always told that when you leave the Korean military, a Korean citizen leaves with a fourth dan black belt. And that if they decide they want to emigrate to another country, they're given a fifth dan just to do it. And so there's a lot of masters that were not high level masters. Master Cho is a master among masters. And I've worked with a number of different masters of all different arts. And I don't think I've had met anybody that had this is a good this is a good explanation of a good excuse to create introduce a distinction that I think is Descartes and not Pascal. But the idea is there's l'esprit de raison and l'esprit de finesse. And I'll put in the show notes who it was that talked about that. I'm going to guess Descartes, but I'm not entirely sure. And the idea is, I remember he says that the spirit of finesse leaps where the spirit of reason plods. And, I think you can see that with, Mozart would have been the spirit of finesse, and Spiliari would have been the spirit of reason. Uh, that there is a type of genius that has this finesse that makes things seem incredibly natural. And that was what was amazing, I think, about Master Cho in his prime was the naturalness of his movement. And they say within the internal arts, within Shingi, they say, we strike, we fight our opponent like going for a walk, and we hit him like snapping our fingers, with this idea that it's a complete and total expression of naturalness. But the place I saw the most naturalness expressed in spontaneous reaction in them, against really challenging opponents was Master Cho.
Hmm. So you saw him
Beyond,
fight.
yeah. Well, and I saw when I was lucky enough when I was young that he was still moving really well, and so I did workshops with him. Somewhere there's a video of me when I'm about 15 years old being used as a placeholder in one of his demonstrations. And where I think he's demonstrating shooting at the imaginary target rather than shooting at the actual target you see, because everything we're doing is moving targets. So it's like shooting ducks. You can't point at the duck. You have to point at where the duck is going to be when the bullets get there, right? Or the duck load gets there. And so, uh, it turns out that's a component of learning how to make everything work, right? You have to understand timing and distance, and so that's what Cho is. Cho was a master on so many levels. He just had such a naturalness about things, and um, an immediacy, and there is a simplicity when someone hits a certain level like that that gives things a certain kind of elegance. And I, being the white guy, I tried to develop theories to help people understand how to move like this guy, but he didn't do it with theories. He did it out of complete naturalness. But I'm trying to come back later and say, and that's why we say within the Japanese traditions, they talk about jitsu and do. And the jitsu is the technique. But the do, or they'll say between ri and ji. Ji is the technique, but ri was the inspiration, right? And so every technique was at some point just the inspiration of the original master.
Mhm.
And then when they broke down what he was doing, they said, okay, it's this way, and you're gonna, But to him, who had not been taught that, who was the first master of that lineage, it had an immediateness that came from a naturalness.
Mhm.
And then traditions tend to get farther and farther from that.
Yeah.
So your challenge is also, how do I recapture that inspiration that this is the packaging of? Like they've given me this technique, but you're always asking yourself, but what is this really? Like, what is it when it lives within itself? What is it in its most organic, natural form? And then you see some of these moves like takedowns that when they work beautifully, it's like poetry in motion. I mean, it's like they say that about bullfighting. They say that 99% of the time it's not wonderful, but that 1%, it's sublime. Right? That's what Michener said about it,
Uh-huh.
and it's just the possibility of that is why they keep trying. Well,
Yeah.
this is like that, but it's a lot easier on the livestock, and, um, you realize it's one of these things that in the beginning, maybe you only get it to happen once in a while, but when it does, you know it. Like when you're kicking the bag, every once in a while, we kick the bag in a very particular way. And every once in a while, when all of the factors all align perfectly, you get a bang that comes out of that bag that it's exceptional. You know it. But you're not getting that every time because this time your leg was a little late and this time your stepping was a little further and there's all these little things. But then as you keep doing this, you keep doing this. And we practice on the bag for hours. Finally, you get to where, dang, you can do this 8 out of 10, right? Well, and then you work your other actions through that, right? And uh so yeah, there is this process of finding that sweet spot where everything coordinates, and it's so different than technique. Uh, but but anyway, this is one of the things that not everybody is lucky enough to have exposure to what I would call a lineage master.
Yeah.
Most of our teachers are along the way teachers that were part of down the path of explanation, like how do we scaffold our way up to this guy who can fly,
Mhm.
you know? And so that was great good fortune to have experienced that, to realize that, okay, there is this like Mozart phenomenon that can happen. This sort of like, I think I mentioned before I had a not a roommate, but a co-renter of a duplex on the other side of the wall who was a child prodigy violin player, and it was unlike anything else. I mean, it was some whole other thing that went on there, and
Yeah.
that's that Speri de finesse that he was talking about. That's Speri de raison works by plotting to try to get itself to that place, but it's trying to capture genius. It's trying to get lightning in a bottle, right? And but so anyway, that's quite away from anger,
Yeah.
but the topic that's the thread through that all is that it's a topic on mastering yourself, and that whether we're talking about getting that kick to go perfectly or we're talking about balancing our own internal energies, it's all about the more we master ourselves, the better performance we get, the smoother everything works. Um, and if you read the Tao Te Ching and he talks about the miraculous way that the sage does nothing and all things get done, that's what they're talking about. That there is this, I think I made the reference before to Crowley and the Book of Lies and the Mountaineer, and I'll put that in there. It's about the thing when the thing does itself, then is it well done. Not,
Mm.
but you no longer do it. And how does my practice transcend myself?
Mhm.
That's yeah.
Yeah, I've had glimpses of that, probably mostly in playing music and in ceremonies, and
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah, it's
Music is a
magic
big
when it
one.
happens.
I think skiing, sometimes people can get to that point where they
Sure.
feel there's just a supernaturalness to it.
Yeah.
Um, no, it's definitely sometimes gets referred to as a peak experience,
Yeah.
right? Is that Maslow, peak experience?
I don't associate it with Maslow.
Oh, okay. We'll see. Somebody did that. I'll put that in the show notes too. There's a whole
Yeah.
thing around peak experience and
Yeah.
that we enter a different state there.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the phrase. Cool. Well, let's leave it there, Brian. And yeah, thank you. That was
Sounds good.
yeah, it was interesting. Talk to you
Yeah.
soon.
See everybody later. Bye bye.